The train, a behemoth of iron and steam, coughed a final black plume into the crisp Wyoming sky before settling into a trembling silence. For the past 3 days, the rhythm of its wheels had been the only constant in Eleanor's life, a relentless, metallic beat that promised a future and simultaneously hammered away at the memory of her past. She gripped the worn leather satchel on the seat beside her, the knuckles of her hand white against the dark hide. Well, Nell, this is it. The voice belonged to Elias, her older brother, a man whose ambition was a tangible thing, sharp as the crease in his new, factory-made suit. He was already on his feet, reaching for their meager luggage in the overhead rack. His face, usually pale from years spent, hunched over account ledgers in Boston, was alight with an almost boyish excitement, a transformation that made him look younger and infinitely more dangerous. They had stepped off the Transcontinental Railroad into Oak Haven, Wyoming territory. 1891. The station was a squat, hastily constructed wooden building dwarfed by the limitless expanse of the prairie. The air here was dry and thin, tasting of sagebrush and distant dust, a stark contrast to the clammy, salt-laden breeze of the Massachusetts coast. Everything seemed bigger, louder, and painted in harsher, more fundamental colors, the unforgiving blue of the sky, the ochre and brown of the earth, the startling, brutal white of the distant, snow-capped peaks. Eleanor followed Elias onto the crowded platform. The noise was a riot of human and animal life, the whinny of horses, the shouts of teamsters loading freight, the babble of a dozen different languages, German, Italian, Chinese, blending into the singular sound of American commerce. This wasn't the lawless Wild West of dime novels. It was the bustling, chaotic, and relentlessly optimistic New West, the beating heart of the nation's relentless westward expansion. "Look at this now," Elias murmured, his eyes scanning the throng with the fervor of a prospector spotting a vein of gold. Opportunity, pure, unadulterated opportunity. Not the tired, inherited fortunes of the East. This is ours to make. Elias had staked everything on a newly formed venture, the Oak Haven Land and Cattle Company. His job, secured through a well-placed connection from his old firm, was chief auditor, a grand title that, for the moment, meant he was the man responsible for bringing order to a chaotic operation thousands of miles from any meaningful oversight. For Eleanor, the move was a necessity. After the scandal, the swift, quiet ruin of their family name back east Oak Haven offered a clean slate, a place where a woman of 23 whose engagement had been broken under a shadow of debt could simply be new. A stout man with a booming laugh and a vest strained by his girth pushed through the crowd toward them. Elias Thorne. "Welcome to God's own country, son."
My name's
Hawthorne, Jedediah Hawthorne.
I'm the rail agent here.
And half-owner of the town's best saloon. Hawthorne's handshake was crushing, his smile too wide to be entirely honest. Elias, ever the gentleman, introduced Eleanor. "My sister, Miss Eleanor Thorne. She'll be keeping house for us until things settle." Eleanor offered a polite, practiced smile. She knew the subtext of Elias's words. She was here not just as a housekeeper, but as a silent partner in his ambition, an anchor of respectability in a town that probably scoffed at the concept. Her job was to create the illusion of a settled, prosperous home, a subtle advertisement of Elias's reliability to the investors back east, who entrusted him with their capital. As Hawthorne guided them toward the freight wagons, Eleanor took in the town proper. Haven was a study in impermanence. The main street was a muddy, rutted scar lined with buildings that looked like they had been hammered together in a single afternoon. The general store, the land office, the imposing two-story facade of the First National Bank, and ominously several identical windowless structures advertising cold storage and fresh goods. Above the low skyline, a skeletal framework of a new building, destined to be the Oak Haven Grand Hotel, testified to an almost reckless faith in the town's future. "The company set us up in a small place," Elias explained, following her gaze. "It's just outside the main grid. We'll be closer to the central cattle yard and away from the distractions of the rail spur." The small house was less small place and more rough-hewn shack. It sat on a rise, isolated from the center of town, overlooking a vast, dusty enclosure where hundreds of longhorn cattle bawled mournfully. The air, already thin, now carried the heavy, pungent smell of manure and damp earth. Inside, the house was a single room with a rough plank floor and a small soot-stained wood stove. Eleanor swallowed her disappointment, pasting on the cheerful, resourceful look she'd perfected on the train. She was a thorn. She could make a home out of anything. As good light, Elias. And that view. She pointed to the immense, sprawling territory beyond the cattle pens. A landscape that seemed to stretch, uninterrupted, all the way to the horizon, where the mountains rose like the jagged teeth of an ancient god. That, Elias said, laying his satchel on the one rickety table, is what matters. That is the new frontier. He opened the satchel, not to retrieve clothing, but to reveal a thick sheaf of papers, ledgers, maps, and land deeds. We're not here to ranch, Nell. The cattle are the bait. We're here to sell the land. The parcels, the railroad, and the government are carving up. They promise civilization, farming, and endless wealth. I'm the one who makes the numbers back that promise up. He uncorked a small bottle of ink, his hand suddenly steady. Tomorrow, I meet the president of the cattle company. The day after, I audit the land records. In 6 months, I will have enough on paper to prove to the New York investors that Oak Haven is the next Chicago. And when they pour in their gold, we take our cut and we go back east. Wealthier and more respected than we ever were? Eleanor watched him, his face a mask of fierce concentration. He was chasing not just money, but vindication. The shame of their father's collapse, the whispers, the lost society, could only be washed clean by a fortune made entirely by their own hand. "And what do I do today?" she asked, pulling her own smaller bag containing only her few dresses and a single hardbound copy of Emerson's essays. Elias glanced at the stove, the unmade cots, the thick layer of dust coating every surface. "You make the promise real, Nell. You turn this shack into a home, a place of order in the wilderness. Start with the dust. It's the enemy of respectability." Eleanor nodded. The task was enormous, but a certain kind of peace settled over her. For weeks, she had felt useless, a burden. Here, in the face of physical necessity, the path was clear. She needed soap, a broom, fresh water, and food. She pulled her bonnet tighter and stepped back outside, inhaling the cold, dusty air. The town, which had seemed so loud and daunting moments ago, now felt like a giant, challenging marketplace. As she walked back towards the rail depot, past the saloon whose swinging doors already promised whiskey and trouble, she felt a subtle shift within herself. And she was not the disgraced daughter of a ruined man. She was a pioneer. She had no inheritance, no fiancé, no safety net, yet only her brother's fierce energy and her own quiet, unyielding will. The journey had ended, but the real test had just begun. Her new life was not a gift. It was a wilderness to be tamed, just like the sprawling land around Oak Haven. The promise of the frontier was simple. Work, and you shall have your reward. It was a terrifying, exhilarating compact. And Eleanor Thorne, for the first time in a long time, felt truly alive to meet its demands. Elias Thorne learned quickly that in Oak Haven, the true measure of a man was not his education, but his nerve. The Oak Haven Land and Cattle Company, he discovered, was a precarious pyramid scheme built on hope and thin accounting. The cattle, which bawled and stamped in the dust-choked pens beneath his window, were merely the visible assets. The real commodity was the promise of civilization, the tracts of land, granted cheaply to the rail barons, now being sliced into lots for homesteaders and speculators, all under the false pretense of lush, easily farmed territory. His immediate superior, a man named Mr. Silas Kincaid, embodied the robber baron ethos of the Gilded Age. Kincaid was the company president in Wyoming. A mountain of a man with a diamond stickpin the size of a pigeon's egg, and eyes that perpetually scanned the room for a weakness to exploit. "Thorne, you're the Boston man," Kincaid had boomed on their first day, ushering Elias into his officer room, whose mahogany desk seemed scandalously out of place in the frontier town. "You know how to make numbers sing? Well, the song we need here is one of exponential growth. The investors back in New York don't care about sagebrush and drought. They care about return on investment, to ensure the latter. Elias did. He began his work in the small, cramped office, the air thick with the smell of lamp oil and the residue of the coal-fired trains. He didn't cook the books in the crude way their father had, a mistake that had brought ruin. Elias practiced a far more sophisticated form of financial alchemy. He shifted expenses for maintaining the vast, overgrazed open range onto the capital side of the ledger, inflating the land's perceived value. He created paper companies, dummy limited liability corporations LLCs, technique new to the frontier, to buy and sell prime parcels back and forth, creating a false market frenzy. The smoke of his cigar and the scent of new ink became his own personal industrial effluvium. Within 3 months, Elias had transformed the company's reports from a mediocre gamble into a tantalizing certainty. The paper worth of Oakhaven land and cattle had doubled, a feat Kincaid rewarded with a substantial bonus and a coveted seat at the Cheyenne Club, the unofficial headquarters of the territory's powerful cattle barons. "It's all steel and smoke, Nell," Elias confessed one late night, his voice hushed but brittle with excitement. As he recounted his daily triumphs, Kincaid is building the Oakhaven Grand Hotel with 20% of the investors' money and pocketing the rest. He's bribing the territorial land registrar with shares in the company to approve questionable claims. If an honest auditor looked at this for 2 minutes, we'd all be ruined. But they don't send honest men, Nell. They send men who understand the game. Eleanor, meanwhile, was fighting her own frontier battle against the dust and the societal scrutiny. She had managed, through sheer force of will, to turn the shack into a respectable, if Spartan, dwelling. But the greater challenge was navigating the tight-knit, suspicious social world of Oakhaven. She was an outsider, too refined for the ranch wives, too close to the raw industry for the few established town ladies. She found her refuge in the small, newly opened lending library, which also served as the town's telegraph office. The telegraphist, a sharp-featured, quiet woman named Martha, was initially reserved, eyed. But Eleanor's steady demeanor and genuine interest in the town's affairs gradually broke the ice. It was in this atmosphere of flickering gaslight and humming telegraph wires that Eleanor began to understand the human cost of Elias's financial ascent. She saw the weary faces of the homesteaders who came to the land office, clutching their savings, betting everything on Elias's inflated acreage maps. She overheard fragments of telegrams sent east messages from small investors demanding confirmation of the boom, or desperate pleas from the local cattle hands demanding their overdue wages. One afternoon, Martha showed her a discarded newspaper from Cheyenne. The front page detailed a bitter labor dispute near a new coal mine further north. "They cut their wages by a third overnight," Martha murmured, pointing to a stark photograph of striking workers facing off against armed company men. Said the steel mills back east were cutting orders, so the mine had to save costs. The owner, he's a silent partner in Kincaid's operation, by the way. The article, a piece of detached industrial reporting, was a cold, hard piece of reality. Elias's exponential growth was predicated on the exploitation of the lowliest workers, men and families existing at the barest edge of survival. The steel of the rail lines and the smoke of the coal mines were not just markers of progress. They were the chains and the cover for the Gilded Age's greed. The tension escalated when Elias became embroiled in a conflict with a local homesteaders cooperative, led by a stubbornly ethical man named Thomas Davies. Davies and his small group of farmers had laid claim to water rights on a crucial piece of riparian land, which Kincaid was intending to sell to a powerful foreign-backed syndicate as prime grazing land. "Davies and his muddy-booted friends are a nuisance," Kincaid spat, throwing a surveyor's map onto Elias's desk. "They're squatters, Thorne. They don't have the capital to defend their claim. Find the flaw in their deed. It up some forgotten territorial statute. I need them gone by month's end." Elias, despite his growing moral unease, saw this as his final test. He spent 2 weeks poring over dusty, ancient government records. He found the flaw not in the homesteader's claim itself, but in the obscure, decade-old railway grant that preceded it. A clause existed, granting the railroad down by extension. The land company, the perpetual right to condemn any claim for a public works project. The project Elias and Kincaid decided upon was a spur line, a completely unnecessary length of track they claimed was vital for shipping future beef. It was a bald-faced lie, a transparent secret deal that used the machinery of American progress to crush the small farmer. When Elias presented the legal justification to Kincaid, the elder man had clapped him on the shoulder, a brutal show of approval. "You are more than just a numbers man, Thorne. You have the killer instinct. You've just earned yourself a 15% interest in the Oakhaven Grand." The victory was hollow. The next day, Eleanor saw Thomas Davies outside the land office. was a man utterly broken, his wife weeping softly beside him. The steel of Elias's newly proposed rail line, though only existing on paper, had driven a spike through their future. That evening, the air between the siblings in their little shack was colder than the Wyoming winter they knew was coming. "They're going to starve, Elias," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling, not with accusation, but with a terrifying realization. "You didn't just take their land, you took their chance." Elias turned from the small stove, his face drawn. The excitement that usually illuminated him was gone, replaced by the heavy pall of the town's industrial smoke. "They didn't play by the rules, Nell. The rules are made by men with capital. They knew the risks when they came out here. I'm protecting our future. We are not going back to Boston in shame. We must be ruthless, or we will be ruined." He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and defiance. "The choice, Eleanor, is between that Madandwater farm and the Gilded Shadow. I choose the gold." Eleanor said nothing, but she looked out the window at the construction site for the Oak Haven Grand, now rising conspicuously in the distance. Its scaffolding looked like a cage. She knew then that the new frontier as promised had been merely the first layer of gold paint. Beneath it was the hard, dangerous reality of steel, smoke, and secret deals, and she and Elias were now fully complicit in its manufacture. The cost of their redemption was rising faster than the price of the land. The weight of their choices settled like the ubiquitous dust, heavy, pervasive, and impossible to truly sweep away. They were wealthy on paper, but spiritually bankrupt, having exchanged their innocence for a 15% share in a hotel built on the ruin of their neighbors. This segment, A Society of Silk and Scorn, will explore the social dynamics of Oak Haven as Elias and Eleanor move from their humble beginnings into the emerging elite, detailing the stark contrast between their newfound luxury and the widespread poverty their success is built upon, and the subtle, biting criticism they face from both the established East Coast society and the rough-hewn Westerners. 6 months after the homesteaders were displaced, the Oak Haven Grand Hotel opened its doors. It was a monument to Elias Thorne's financial acuity and Silas Kincaid's audacious greed. The hotel stood 4 stories high, a beacon of Victorian excess in a town of weathered shacks, its lobby floor tiled with imported Italian marble, its dining room lit by electric bulbs, a novelty even in some eastern cities. Elias and Eleanor had moved into their own house, not a shack this time, but a freshly painted 2-story Queen Anne cottage on the newly christened Avenue of Commerce. It was ostentatious by Oak Haven standards, replete with bay windows, a small lawn, to a wide porch where Eleanor sometimes took her tea. They were no longer the struggling arrivals. They were the new aristocracy of the Wyoming territory. Eleanor, despite her persistent unease over the Thomas Davies affair, had thrown herself into the work of transformation. The silk gowns and Parisian gloves she had reluctantly packed now served a vital purpose. They were her armor in the escalating social war. Ilias's business success demanded that Eleanor maintain a flawless social facade. They needed to attract the right kind of attention, the kind that drew investment, not suspicion. Their social debut was the Grand Ball, held in the Oak Haven Grand's chandeliered ballroom, suffocatingly ornate space where the prairie's dust was momentarily held at bay by polished wood and heavy velvet curtains. Eleanor wore a deep emerald silk dress, a color chosen to complement her dark hair and signaled their new prosperity. As she entered the room on Elise's arm, she noticed the immediate dualistic reaction. The town, old guard, the ranch barons, and the few established judges regarded them with a mixture of scorn and calculation. They saw Elias not as a peer, but as Kincaid's ambitious protege, a necessary tool. And Eleanor as a woman who had clearly spent too much time amongst Boston's disgraced elite. "Miss Thorne, your dress is quite magnificent," drawled Judge Harlan, a man whose family had owned land in the territory since before the Civil War. His tone, however, suggested the dress was too new, too showy, and clearly bought with nouveau rich capital. A little grand for Oak Haven, perhaps. "We prefer practicality over polish out here. Practicality is excellent for managing a ranch," Judge Eleanor replied, offering a cool, polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But for attracting the kind of Eastern investment Oak Haven needs to truly flourish, a little polish goes a long way. Wouldn't you agree?"
Elias
Meanwhile, was surrounded by the men of capital, speaking in low, confidential tones about future land purchases and railroad subsidies. He was charming, precise, and entirely ruthless. He had mastered the language of the Gilded Age's smooth, deceptive jargon of progress, efficiency, and manifest destiny that conveniently obscured the poverty being generated just outside the ballroom doors. The stark contrast of Oakhaven society was brutally apparent at the ball. Inside, the air was hot with champagne and ambition. Outside, less than a block away, lay the shantytown, a collection of crude tents and repurposed rail cars that housed the influx of laborers and destitute homesteaders, the very people whose sweat and ruin were financing the marble floors. Eleanor, dancing a polite quadrille with a visiting Chicago speculator, found her eyes repeatedly drawn to the tall, heavily curtained windows. She knew the music and laughter were a cruel mockery to those surviving just beyond the light. The most stinging social scorn came not from the rough Westerners, but from the East. A few weeks after the ball, Eleanor received a visit from Mrs. Abigail Wentworth, the wife of a powerful New York bank director and a woman who had once been her mother's closest confidant. Mrs. Wentworth was passing through on her way to California. The visit, conducted over Eleanor's imported English tea service, was a masterclass in passive aggression. "My dear Eleanor," Mrs. Wentworth sighed, delicately adjusting the expensive lace on her cuff, "I must say, you have made this wilderness quite presentable. One almost forgets the lack of proper pedigree here." She then leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But my husband, he mentioned that Mr. Thorne's business dealings with Mr. Kincaid are a bit vigorous. Elias has a wonderful energy, of course, but Oakhaven is so far from any real accountability, isn't it? One hears whispers of land grabs and excessive debt financing." Eleanor felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She understood the true meaning of the message. Elias's gold was tainted. While they were wealthy enough to buy things, they could not buy back their reputation, nor could they silence the judgment of the established Eastern fortunes. The Society of Silk in Oakhaven was merely a cheap imitation of the real society, which still held the power to grant or deny ultimate respectability. "Elias is bringing much-needed development to this territory, Mrs. Wentworth," Eleanor stated calmly, pouring more tea. "He is simply being more progressive than the older generation cares for. Progress," your Mrs. Wentworth countered with a chilling sweetness, "is simply a grand term for making an enemy. And the East has a very long memory." This conversation crystallized the family's dilemma. They had succeeded financially, becoming the apex of the Oakhaven social ladder, but they were trapped in a social limbo. The Eastern elite viewed them as vulgar, ruthless opportunists, too loud, too successful, and too close to scandal. The Western poor, represented by the angry, desperate faces Eleanor glimpsed near the freight yards, viewed them with undisguised hatred, seeing them as the direct cause of their destitution. Eleanor often sought refuge in the quiet of the small lending library, still run by Martha. Martha, who heard the gossip and the coded telegrams, offered a unique, neutral perspective. "They talk about you, Miss Thorne," Martha said one afternoon, stacking books. "The men in the saloon call your brother the broker of broken promises. The ladies call you the Duchess of Dust. And what do the people who live in the shantytown call us?" Elena asked, her voice barely audible. Martha paused, her hands still. "They don't call you anything, Miss Thorne. They just look at you. They see the silk you wear, and they see the bread they can't afford. It's a language louder than any word. This constant awareness, the knowledge that their beautiful Queen Anne cottage is built on the foundation of others' suffering, began to wear on Eleanor. Elias, conversely, became more insulated. He bought a powerful imported stallion, started wearing a broad, expensive beaver hat like Kincaid's, and spoke only of interest rates and dividends. He began to dismiss Eleanor's anxieties as feminine weakness, a remnant of their failed past. "You worry too much about their scorn, Nell," Elias scoffed one evening, counting a large wad of freshly issued banknotes. "Scorn is the tax we pay for success. Let them despise us. They are poor because they are weak, and we are wealthy because we were strong enough to take the opportunity." But the scorn was inescapable. It arrived one morning in the form of a small, crudely painted sign left on their newly trimmed lawn. It read in shaky block letters, "Thorne, built on bones." Eleanor saw the sign first. It was a tangible piece of the anger they had generated, a direct accusation from the voiceless. Before Elias could see it and dismiss it as the work of some drunken hooligan, Eleanor ripped the sign out of the ground, tearing the cheap wood. She burned it in the stove, watching the accusation turn to smoke and ash. That night, lying in her luxurious bed in her elegant, empty room, Eleanor realized the final, crucial difference between the wealthy of the East and the wealthy of the new frontier. In Boston, the sins of the wealthy were hidden behind generations of inherited manors and thick stone walls. Here in Oakhaven, where the walls were thin and the landscape was vast and unforgiving, the sins were as visible as the smokestack of the train station, a constant, black reminder rising against the clear blue sky. They had traded their ruined reputation for wealth, but they had not escaped judgment. They were living in a beautiful, gilded cage, surrounded by the raw, dangerous reality of those they had displaced. The silk of their new society was merely a thin shroud covering the bitter foundation of scorn that underpinned their entire existence. The price of the new frontier's promise, Eleanor realized, was not just money. It was their very soul, and the society they had built was a reflection of that agonizing transaction. The year 1893 brought with it a chill far deeper than the Wyoming winter. The panic of 1893, severe national depression, triggered by a cascade of railroad bankruptcies, and the depletion of the gold reserve sent shockwaves across the American continent, shattering the brittle confidence of the Gilded Age. Even in Oakhaven, promised boomtown, the air grew thick with anxiety and foreboding. The collapse hit the Oakhaven Land and Cattle Company with devastating speed. Elias Thorne, once Kincaid's golden boy, found himself scrambling to contain a financial inferno. The Eastern investors, now facing their own ruin, demanded immediate liquidity. But the land whose value Elias had so brilliantly inflated on paper was worthless without buyers. The speculators vanished, the rail construction halted, and the newly tiled streets of the Avenue of Commerce became eerily silent. "It's not just us, Nell," Elias said one morning, pacing their elegant parlor with the frantic energy of a trapped animal. His beaver hat lay forgotten on the mahogany table. His face was gaunt with sleepless nights. "The entire country is contracting. Coxey's army is marching on Washington. The banks are failing daily. Kincaid fled to Mexico. Last night left me holding the empty sack. The shame of being abandoned by his mentor was overshadowed only by the colossal weight of the company's debts." Elias had not merely managed the fraud, he had structured it. The paper companies he created to inflate prices were now the primary creditors, and the entire edifice was teetering. He had gambled their family's entire desperate hope for vindication on an unstable boom, and the bust had arrived. The economic crisis quickly translated into acute social unrest in Oakhaven. The shanty town swelled with out-of-work railroad laborers and ranch hands whose wages had been cut to zero. Their desperation was palpable, coalescing into an organized group that met openly near the rail yard, discussing grievances and demanding back wages from the defunct company. The most visible and most volatile leader of the unrest was a towering, charismatic former coal miner named Gideon Pike. Pike was not just demanding money, he was demanding justice. He spoke eloquently of the weight of westward expansion, arguing that the wealth created by the industry had been stolen from the very men who built the tracks and fenced the land. They talk of progress. They talk of civilization. Eleanor overheard Pike shout one bitter afternoon, his voice carrying clearly from the rail yard across the sudden, desolate silence of the Avenue of Commerce. "But we are the steel they built it on, and they cast us aside like scrap iron. They built their palaces, the Grand Hotel on our backs, and now we will hold them accountable." The Hotel Elias's 15% reward stood as a massive, glittering symbol of the town's failure and the Thorns' tainted prosperity. Eleanor, who had been focused on maintaining the Society of Silk, now found herself directly confronting the scorn. One chilly afternoon, she was walking to the market when she was stopped by the small, withered figure of Thomas Davies's wife, the homesteader whom Elias had ruined a year prior. The woman's eyes were not filled with tears, but with a cold, terrifying emptiness. She held a basket of dried weeds, all she could find to eat. "Your brother," the woman said, her voice dry and rustling like the dead leaves beneath their feet. "He has his Queen Anne house. My children have the open road." She nodded towards the Grand Hotel. "When the fire comes, Miss Thorne, it won't start with the shacks. It will start with the kindling." This encounter was a physical blow to Eleanor. She realized that the historical process, the relentless, unchecked expansion of American capital that they had so eagerly joined, was not an abstract force. It was a hammer that had crushed the vulnerable, and she and Elias were now standing on the remnants of that destruction. The private pressure of guilt and fear was merging with the public crisis. Elias's coping mechanism was to retreat into a desperate search for a solution. He worked day and night in his office, now littered with worthless stock certificates and foreclosure notices. His plan became to save himself, and by extension, Eleanor, by sacrificing the rest of the company. He began negotiating with a powerful Eastern financier, a vulture capitalizing on the panic. This man, Mr. J.P. Harrington, was interested in acquiring the Oakhaven rail assets at a ridiculously low price, but only if the purchase was clean. This meant Elias had to systematically destroy all evidence of Kincaid's and his own fraudulent accounting. "I need to burn the ledgers, Nell," Elias admitted one night, his voice strained. "The real ones. The ones showing the fake land sales and the diverted funds. If Harrington sees the depth of the deception, he'll walk, and we go to prison. If I destroy them, I save our names, I save our house, and I save us from the debtor's cell." It was a terrible, isolating choice. Salvation through final, irreversible corruption.
Eleanor.
Though terrified by the prospect of prison, refused. "We cannot destroy the evidence, Elias. Those books show the names of the people Kincaid stole from the small investors. The ranch hands owed wages. If you burn those, you erase their last chance for compensation. You erase the truth." "The truth is death," Elias hissed back, slamming his fist on the table. "This is not some moral philosophy class, Eleanor. This is survival. The weight of this expansion is crushing us all. I am choosing us over the paper claims of fools." Their argument was interrupted by a deafening roar. A thick column of black smoke rose into the twilight sky. The Oakhaven Grand Hotel was on fire. Gideon Pike's threats had become terrifying reality. The unrest had boiled over. The fire was not a spontaneous accident. It was an act of brutal, desperate protest. In the chaos, Elias grabbed the satchel containing the incriminating ledgers. "I'm going to the bank vault," he yelled over the crackle of the distant flames. "I can't burn them here. If the town burns, the vault is the only safe place. Wait for me." He bolted out the door, leaving Eleanor alone in the house, which was now bathed in the terrifying, flickering orange light of the conflagration.
Ow.
Eleanor, however, did not wait. She knew Elias was heading to the bank not to protect the records for the benefit of the creditors, but to ensure he could access them to destroy them at the opportune moment. She threw a shawl over her head and ran towards the town center, dodging panicked citizens and the volunteer fire brigade. When she reached the bank, a sturdy stone building near the hotel, she saw Elias struggling with the night watchman, trying to gain entry to the vault room. The fire was magnificent in its destruction. It was not just burning a building, it was consuming the symbol of their greed. The imported silk and marble were melting into a pool of industrial residue. As Elias finally shoved the watchman aside and fumbled with the vault key, Eleanor made her choice. The weight of the westward expansion, the pressure to succeed, the pressure to hide their shame, the pressure of a collapsing economy had defined their lives. But now she saw a path to redemption that was not financial, but moral. She did not follow Elias into the vault. Instead, she ran straight to the telegraph office. Martha was there, surprisingly calm amidst the chaos, sending reports of the disaster east. "Martha, I need you to send a coded telegram," Eleanor breathed, leaning on the counter, her heart hammering. "A long one. It's to Mr. J.P. Harrington in New York. I want you to tell him that Elias Thorne is attempting to destroy the financial records of the Oakhaven Company to conceal fraud. Tell him the full truth." Martha's eyes widened, but she saw the terrible conviction in Eleanor's face. She nodded once, and her fingers began to tap out the relentless, damning rhythm of the Morse code. Eleanor walked back out into the smoky street, the Grand Hotel now a blazing skeleton. She was walking away from Elias, away from the promise of wealth and vindication, and towards an uncertain future defined by honesty and poverty. Elias would soon emerge from the vault, perhaps with the ledgers safe, perhaps with them destroyed. But it would no longer matter. The telegram, an instantaneous piece of communication powered by the very expansion that had ruined them, was already carrying the truth across the continent. Eleanor had exchanged the steel, smoke, and secret deals for the terrifying, liberating weight of the truth. The collapse of the boom had brought ruin, but it had also brought clarity. The fire had burned down their house of cards, and now she would face the echoes of the age with nothing but her own conscience intact. The fire that consumed the Oak Haven Grand Hotel in 1893 was more than an act of protest. It was a punctuation mark in American history. It signaled the violent end of the territory's brief, reckless boom and the beginning of a prolonged, hard-fought economic reality. The aftermath for the Thorne siblings was immediate and devastating. Elias, emerging from the bank vault with the satchel of ledgers, found the town in chaos, and the telegram Lenora's act of betrayal and conscience already in the hands of J.P. Harrington's legal agents. Harrington, uninterested in a complicated fraud investigation, used Eleanor's confession to leverage a near-total acquisition of the Oak Haven assets, demanding that Elias take the fall for all financial malfeasance. Elias, faced with the certainty of prison, made a cold, desperate deal. He signed over their house, all remaining capital, and his entire future inheritance to Harrington's holding company in exchange for immunity from prosecution. When he finally found Eleanor, standing amidst the smoldering ruins of the hotel, the accusation in his eyes was more chilling than any winter wind. "You destroyed me, Eleanor," he said, his voice stripped of all its Boston refinement, leaving only a raw, terrified fury. "You chose those dirt farmers and a dead, useless morality over your own brother. We could have walked away rich, and now we are penniless and branded." "We were already branded, Elias," she replied, looking him squarely in the eye. "The stain was just hidden by the silk. I chose to save our name, not our money. The weight of that expansion was too heavy to carry any longer. The rift was absolute." Elias, ruined and unforgiving, took the last eastbound train out of Oak Haven and out of Eleanor's life, vowing never to return. He spent the next 3 decades a ghost in the financial underworld of Chicago, forever chasing the adrenaline of the lost boom. 25 years later, 1918, the passage of time did not erase the past. It merely transformed its presence into an echo. Eleanor Thorne never left Oak Haven. Having forfeited their home, she took a modest room above the general store, and through the sheer force of her organizational skills and reputation for unimpeachable honesty, a reputation earned by that one decisive telegram, she eventually secured the position of chief clerk at the newly formed Territorial Land Office. It was a life of meticulous, quiet labor, far removed from the glittering ambition of her youth. The town itself had settled into a sustainable, if unremarkable, existence. The shantytown was gone, replaced by modest, permanent homes for the working class. The avenue of commerce had respectable, but not extravagant, businesses. The Oak Haven Grand was never rebuilt. Its ruins, a pile of jagged stone and twisted metal, remained on the main street, a permanent, physical reminder of the boom and the bust, and a constant echo of the vanished age. Eleanor, now in her late 40s, was a respected solitary figure in the community. She had dedicated herself to correcting the wrongs of the past, meticulously tracking down the small investors and homesteaders the old company had defrauded, using her position to facilitate modest, slow recompense when she could. One rainy autumn afternoon, a thick official-looking envelope arrived for her. It contained an obituary from a Chicago newspaper. Elias Thorne had died penniless in a boarding house, a victim of the Spanish flu epidemic, a final, impersonal casualty of the rapidly expanding world he had tried to master. With the obituary came a small package containing one single item: the worn leather satchel he had carried off the train 27 years earlier. Eleanor opened the satchel, her heart a mixture of grief and detachment. Inside, she found not cash or jewels, but the original ledgers of the Oak Haven Land and Cattle Company. The very books she had tried to save, and he had tried to burn, had been his constant companion, his only true possession. More significant, however, was a folded piece of paper tucked between the pagiza, hastily written letter. Dated 3 weeks before his death. "Eleanor, I carried these books as a fool carries a stone. For years I told myself they were my insurance, my evidence against Kincaid, the proof of my brilliance. But they were only a record of my shame. and your single, brave decision. You were right. The gold was tainted. The only true measure of a life is what you leave behind that isn't dead. I leave you these. They are the truth. Use them to finish what you started. Tell no one. Let the echoes be quiet now. Elias. Eleanor wept. Not for the loss of a brother she had mourned long ago, but for the lost boy who had stepped off the train with such bright, terrible ambition. Elias had finally, in his last act, returned the truth, the critical piece of the historical record, to the one person who could truly handle its weight. The legacy of redemption, armed with the original, unburned ledgers, Eleanor finally had the power to fully confront the ghosts of Oakhaven. She took a 2-month leave of absence, dedicating herself to a final, arduous accounting. She worked alongside Martha, who had become the town's postmistress and a quiet pillar of the community. They used the telegraph and the nascent long-distance telephone service to contact the descendants of the ruined homesteaders and the few small surviving investors. Eleanor didn't offer wealth. She offered clarity. She provided the documents that allowed these families to press claims against Harrington's successor companies, forcing them to acknowledge the old fraud and secure modest delayed restitution. It's not enough to make them rich, but enough to restore their legacy and their honor. The most poignant moment came when she presented the full, honest account of the Davies claim to Thomas Davies' son, a man who now ran a successful livery stable in a neighboring town. "Your father was right, Mr. Davies," Eleanor said, handing him the legal documents that would finalize his family's right to a small, symbolic portion of the riparian land. "This town was built on an injustice. Your family's perseverance is the only real good to come out of the Oakhaven." Boom. Mr. Davies looked at the papers, then at the small, unassuming woman who had once been the elegant Duchess of Dust. "We never forgot the woman who ran to the telegraph that night, Miss Thorne," he said quietly. "We just never knew who she was fighting for." Eleanor simply smiled, the first truly peaceful smile she had worn in decades. The echoes of the vanished age were finally fading, replaced not by the triumphant shouts of progress, but by the quiet hum of justice being done. Eleanor Thorne lived out her days in Oakhaven, a respected, even revered figure. She never regained the high society of the East, nor did she acquire the fortune Elias had sought. Her legacy was not built on silk or steel, but on the painstaking effort to heal the wounds left by the brutal surge of American expansion. She had chosen to bear the heavy truth, and, in doing so, had redeemed not just herself, but the bitter, compromised ambition of her brother. The new frontier had vanished, but the simple promise of integrity remained.